Hi guys, thanks for tuning into this special episode of Nuggets News and Datadash channel. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Alex, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
And we first met back in Australia, and things have been absolutely crazy since then. Your channel has exploded; it's the biggest crypto channel by far. So, what did you think of that period when it was going crazy, and what's it been like now?
Oh man, it's been crazy. Since December of 2017, things have definitely cooled down nonetheless. But it was a really interesting period. I'd used YouTube for 11 years. Never would have thought people would want to hear me talk about financial markets. So it's been a big change, and it's still something that I do full time and I have a big passion for. And I've continued to grow kind of I think my place in the crypto space, which is really the passion for peer-to-peer digital currency and money and finding a store of value in crypto. But outside of that, it's been pretty good. I think the last time we met was back in February. You and interestingly enough, Bo from Cryptocurrency Australia,
Yeah.
you were the first two YouTubers I met when I was doing my trip, interestingly enough. So it was really cool to see you guys along the way and see how the space has grown in that case. But
Yeah.
things have been good nonetheless. It's kind of hard to summarize, I guess, the past year.
Yeah, I guess I was a bit shocked at how young you were and how smart you were. So as you said, you're on YouTube for 11 years. So what were your passions and what was your direction before this all sort of came to be?
Oh man, well, I don't think any of my channels are up anymore, but I used to do the stereotypical things. I used to do skits with my friends. We used to do, I tried gaming, things of that sort when I was younger. But the big thing I really loved about YouTube, and I saw it early on back in, it was 2007. I had basically saw the passion of being able to upload your own videos and having kind of, in a sense, like, of course there's a framework on YouTube, but letting anyone with a camcorder be able to do that. So when they came out with these things called flip cams, they're like these really cheap cameras you can plug and has a USB stick. Me and my friend just started making videos all the time, and probably no one watched them, but it was fun to do it.
Yeah, I think it was the alternative media that really got me down the rabbit hole when the GFC was happening, and you could watch people like Peter Schiff have a rant, and you could watch these documentaries that were coming out about the banks and the Fed, and that really started my journey. Was that sort of a similar journey for you into gold and silver and sound money, or?
Absolutely, man. Yeah, that was actually kind of like my next step in YouTube. So those early days when I was using YouTube, I was always kind of like just kind of getting by in life and stuff. I was very content and happy. I've grown up in a very nice family and household and everything, but I never really had any serious passions. And when I had started to learn about the financial system and I started studying politics, economics, business, entrepreneurship, finance, whatever you can imagine, pretty much all the categories in that sense. I started going down the rabbit hole and I started learning about economics predominantly and learning about cryptocurrencies by understanding the central banking system and things of that sort from the financial crisis, which I think sparked a lot of people to get interested in learning about it.
Yeah.
And having the internet there was such a unique tool because you finally had the ramifications to actually understand this in a really simple way. And from there, yeah, that's how I discovered Bitcoin in 2011. At least the brand of it, I didn't understand it until a little bit later, but
Yeah.
it was definitely a rabbit hole nonetheless.
I guess for your viewers, my background, I'm a pharmacist. I no longer work in the industry, but I was so confused by what we were seeing and being taught at uni versus what was happening in the real world when I was working on pracs and stuff like that. And that led me down that rabbit hole of what's going on in this industry and the money that drives it, and then obviously how the banks and money works and all sorts of conspiracies. And you've got to, I think that's important to know, you've got to determine what's conspiracy versus what's people actually trying to reveal facts. So that's something that's pretty hard to do online these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, this is something I think we were talking about before the call. A big issue that I think people struggle with, and even in the crypto space, this is one self-criticism of the crypto space, is that people tend to view things in a very black and white nature. And that's something that's been kind of caused in our very kind of a polarized society. We're very quick to assume one side or the other. And that's the thing is usually we'll just take anything at face value sometimes because we expect things to come very quickly
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree.
in technology.
I think we see those people that just push Bitcoin and say everything else is crap, and I think you have to acknowledge that blockchain is so early on; it's going to have other applications that we might not even know yet, and yet people are saying that everything else is crap. And I'm very much of the opinion that we have to give these things a chance to succeed. We don't know what they're going to be good at yet, so just to pigeonhole them and say that nothing else is going to work, I think it's a bit close-minded.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I still love Bitcoin. For example, I am worried about, whether or not we'll be able to continue stacking hashing power, and if we do, the ramifications of it. But that's not so much, I don't hold that as a criticism of Bitcoin. It's been one of the most secure distributed networks on the world. And that's why I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, but at the same time, I am very eager to find other technologies of reaching consensus, being able to process more throughput, being able to do more private transactions. Big problem with Bitcoin is that it's not private at the moment. It's not, it doesn't have fungibility. Those are very important properties of what Satoshi originally envisioned, which was peer-to-peer digital cash. So I think at the same time, as you mentioned, we need to understand the more cryptocurrencies we have out there that are genuine projects that might be taking a slightly different approach, the better. The more, I guess, purchasing power and just general power you take away from the central banks and actually using it and having incentive structures to use it.
Yeah, and I think Bitcoin can absorb all those other features, and even Ethereum to some degree, on what works better on the smaller chains. And the power argument, power consumption for Bitcoin is also one that can be maybe counter-argued by, this could drive a whole revolution of renewables. If Bitcoin gets to 90 or 100% renewables, and other industries can take a leaf from Bitcoin's book.
Yeah, I'm really excited. That was one thing I had as a big misconception about a year ago. Is I thought, it's all being done in these big coal power plants in China, and they're driving up the energy demand. And then I actually talked to someone he actually worked for a family fund, and helps to run a mining operation for an individual in Canada. And he's like, no, Nick, you have to understand, like, the whole system is actually that it's actually fueling use of a cheaper electricity, which ends up being renewable energy, and they try to find systems where they can continue to reduce costs. So I was actually really excited to hear about that. And just seeing the concept as well, I think a lot of people don't really understand in a simple term what proof of work's really doing. It's taking power and turning that into network security. And that's extremely exciting. If it means that you can have something that's highly immutable and censorship resistant, I mean, that's game changing. Add privacy and fungibility to that, Bitcoin will be money for the world, so long as you can help it scale as well.
I agree. I think Bitcoin is going to be king, and it wouldn't surprise me to see a lot more 51% attacks this year. And it's that education, and people go, how is this happening? And then they learn about proof of work, and they learn that Bitcoin is 100-factor bigger than a lot of these other coins, and they go, oh, geez, okay, this is important. Bitcoin is important, and we're already seeing other coins kind of piggyback off Bitcoin's security as well.
Yeah, that's the one thing I always tell people about proof of work. There's a reason you can't have a plethora of proof of work chains, because you leave yourself vulnerable. That network security that proof of work provides is only guaranteed if you have the largest chain, in the sense of, or sorry, not the largest chain, I wouldn't say, the largest amount of hashing power derived from computer hardware that can actually run that algorithm.
Yeah.
So Ethereum can't be attacked by Bitcoin because they run different algorithms and they have different machines that are used to mine for those different networks. But if I'm, for example, running, Bitcoin Cash or some kind of fork off of a currency, this is why forks are very worrisome, because if the original network miners want to attack that network and double spend, they can easily do it. They need much less hashing power. And then, as you mentioned, a lot of the altcoins that are forks that don't share the same brand in that case.
Yeah, and I think Bitcoin Cash ABC implemented those checkpoints, but we won't go down that whole rabbit hole about the different versions of Bitcoin today. Other cryptocurrencies, I know you've been big on Nano in terms of that. You said you're going down the currency value. I think Dash is one that's got a good community. Is that what you see as the defining factor for what is going to succeed? Just building that community with a good wallet that works and actually having people use it in the real world?
Yeah, so I think those are big steps. And you mentioned Dash and Nano, which are, I'd say, probably in my top 5, 10 cryptocurrencies, in the sense of the reason being, I'd say that is because I believe that there are a lot of great applications for blockchain and distributed networks. And I think we've started to see some of those over the past few years. But the biggest thing is that I keep on seeing people chase, what's the killer application for blockchain or distributed systems? Yeah. And I think it's been there from the start. What really kicked all this off, and it's money. And I think a lot of people as well get caught up in an argument between two things when you go down that rabbit hole. They say, okay, Bitcoin is now a store of value, or no, you have more in the Bitcoin Cash and ABC and Satoshi camp. You're like, no, it's more cash in this case. It's Satoshi's vision. And I say, they're not different. You can't have a split between the two in this case. You need to be able to transmit that store of value. And in fact, Bitcoin's beauty is that it can be a store of value, have all of the properties of gold, if not better, being finite, but being able to transmit it across the world, feeless, peer-to-peer and not having to deal with the interference of any third parties, and censorship resistant as well. It literally is the next evolution in money in that case, taking all the properties, the store of value that gold had, but also fixing the lack of limited supply that currency had. And that's what I'm really excited about.
I completely agree, and Bitcoin is beautiful. I think it should be the biggest part of everyone's portfolio, but I still see all the people that come into the space and they own no Bitcoin. And people argue, again, it's that black and white nature that you're talking about. If you're in Venezuela, Bitcoin has acted as the best store of value on earth for you. If you're in China and you're trying to get $10 million out of the country,
Yep.
Bitcoin is a medium of exchange for you. Bitcoin is different things to different people. So it's funny to watch people argue about what Bitcoin is, I think. But I wanted to talk about gold and silver, so let's dive into that now. Do you still see them having a place? I'm personally, I think they've got a very different application again to if we have a financial downturn. A lot of these big pension funds, they can't put hundreds of billions of dollars in Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. They're going to move a percentage into gold and maybe silver.
Yeah, I would say over the next few years, gold and silver still hold their weight as the leading. Well, it's not the largest store of value in the world. That would be probably properties and currency, but as a hedging store of value against inflation and governments. Yeah, I think gold and silver is still going to hold it. I've been talking on my channel as I think you and I kind of share that kind of view, Alex, of taking a macro perspective and viewing all kinds of markets. The gold pattern that just broke out recently was a massive long-term wedge over multiple years since the peak back in 2011 for precious metals. And it's been a multi-year wedge, and finally we've gotten above it. And it's at a time where central banks are finally starting to roll back their balance sheets and raise interest rates. We just had to stop doing that in the U.S. because it was so disastrous for equities, and now we're starting to reverse the trend and play the same system. So yeah, I would say that I think I predict that sometime in 2020, these commodity, or more specifically precious metals super cycles, they happen very quickly on the bull side, just like crypto. And I think you could very well see silver retest back up to 50. I think you could see gold test back up to, I think it was 1900 an ounce. I might be off on that. But yeah, I think that you could see that by 2020 if central banks continue their monetary tapering in this case. That is, so you have to have the right situation.
And in Australia and plenty of other countries, gold has just broken out to all-time highs because the Aussie dollar has gone from $1.10 US down to 70 cents. So again, it's all relevant to where you are. And I think we'll talk about monetary policy in a second. But for me, that big macro view on the yearly gold chart is the big run-up when for the first time in history, they really lowered interest rates and then printed money. And people thought, we're going to have huge inflation. And then we had the big pullback over the last few years as central banks were telling people, we're going to undo this, we're going to unwind, everything's going to go back to normal. And now I think we're starting to see this bluff of, hold on, we're already putting the brakes on quantitative tightening, as they call it. In Australia, I think we've missed a whole cycle. We're still at record low interest rates since the GFC, and now the economy and the housing market's turning down. So do you agree with that central banks have kind of backed themselves in this corner and they're going to have to lower rates or print money or some sort of stimulus?
I can't remember. I hate to use kind of flashy names like this, but I think it was either the Rothschilds or like one of the major, the kind of family funds in the world made a comment on the BIS and global central banks and saying that we are going through one of the most interesting monetary experiments in history. And I have no doubt that that is what we're going through right now. We've been doing it for the past, really the past decade more precisely. But I think it ties in a lot to what people are debating about with modern monetary theory and things of that sort, with governments being able to just print into oblivion. And I don't think it's too far off from what we've seen in the past. And I think we're repeating those mistakes, but we're masking it behind this advanced financial terminology. And you eventually come back to the realization that there is more credit and debt in the system than there is money to pay it back. And it's going to become more and more a burden on people who are and the poor middle class because they're not investing in assets, which are always going up. So as the Fed keeps doing this, the assets will keep moving up. But the purchasing power of people who are just mom and pop individuals saving in their account, they're going to keep getting screwed over. And I think that that's the issue here. That's why we have such an unstable economy, even when things are recovering, like you mentioned. In Australia now, people can't afford houses at the prices they're at, and housing sales are plummeting and prices are following. It's that we haven't fixed the underlying economy with real fundamentals.
Yeah, and in Finland recently, they just stopped their universal basic income policy. So they tried the opposite thing of just printing money and giving it to the lower end, and they still found that didn't quite work. And I think that shows us that economies are very complex, and you can't just lower interest rates or print money or give out money to people. It's far more sort of systemic than that. And one thing that really interests me is when I went down the rabbit hole, you sort of get this notion that everything's going to fall apart. And all these commentators say, silver's going to $1,000, it's going to happen next year, and they've been saying this for 10 years. But you look at it, and you look at the US, 22 trillion, they've just passed in debt. But then you look at the other countries and you think they're probably in more trouble. And there's actually demand for US dollars as long as it's the world reserve currency, as long as they've got the biggest equity markets and bond markets, and all these other countries are printing money, and it's probably flowing over to the US and propping up the US market. So it's the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry, I think is the saying. But do you agree with that? I think the US has still got that dominance for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously a bias because I live in the U.S. I think in a sense, but I would say that more than anything, as someone coming from an investor perspective, the U.S. had a lot of things happen over the past few years that gave it a very good set of benefits. And then, as you mentioned, there's a lot of countries who set themselves up in a really bad position. So the mixture of currency crises we're seeing right now are countries that now need to get U.S. dollars. And the reason being is Turkey is a great example. They had too much U.S. dollar denominated debt. This is a similar issue as well. And I think in Argentina, a lot of the countries as well that are going through this right now. And that was a really big issue because in the United States, we have done everything to shrink global liquidity. Interest rates are going up, and not to mention as well, we had the tax reform in the United States, and it gave a slight window of time for all the money that it exported out of the U.S. that was going to go into other global markets, probably developing economies like India and China, now scooped right back to the United States for that window and period of time where it could come back and be repatriated. And then that's been investing into U.S. assets and going into stock buybacks. So as you mentioned as well, the equities play a role too. If all that money is coming in and it's going to be propping up stocks and they're going to be buying every single dip to price it higher, then that provides a guaranteed opportunity to make money. And that's exactly what Apple's been doing and all these big tech companies.
Yeah, I think it's crazy. And it's also something that a lot of fund managers, you listen to their interviews, and this whole value investing and PE ratios has almost gone out the window to some degree. And the only trade was to buy as money's been printed over the past decade. And I think that's leaving a lot of people sort of scratching their heads. And I think there's a lot of money that's still on the sidelines that's looking to find a home. And I think, unfortunately, equity markets and probably in the US are still going to be pretty appetizing. But let's move on to other, sectors. So in the US, it's particularly easy to get exposure these days with all the ETFs. We just saw Arbor launch their app. I think there's another one. Is it Quants? I think, or Quant Fury, something like that. There's so many ways for people to get zero fee trading and exposure. It's a little bit harder in Australia. There's still ways. But what other sectors have you been liking? I know you're a big fan of uranium and cannabis stocks and all that, but do you love the fact that as a young investor these days, there's all these ETFs to get good exposure?
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the most amazing things right now is that we have such a range of exposure, and whether or not you have to whether or not you really find a passion around it, you kind of have to do it in a sense. Like you have to keep it invested somewhere, and again, that's why I'm so passionate with being a macro trader. But yeah, I would say that cannabis stocks. I think the big run up is going to come when the U.S. is getting to the corner of legalizing. And I think that's going to be 2020 and beyond. I used to be very optimistic about this trend early on back in the early 2010s, but I would say it's going to take a while before we really get it. Right now, we're getting this wave of speculation with Canada legalizing it. Outside of that, though, I've gotten really interested as well, kind of while currency's been a little bit on the sidelines, looking into Forex a little bit. So I always recommend people to check into that. But yeah, I mean, right now, really my play is commodities. I think that you've got an opportunity. This is the time to hedge more than anything. If central banks continue what they're doing, I, for years, have been like, nope, don't buy gold, don't buy silver, just between my friends and family. Have a little bit of exposure, but not be too excessive because the rules hadn't changed. It was, playing in that system you mentioned. And until that changed, which it's starting to change, I think, with the central bank balance sheets, then it's time to finally start going to the hedge. Yeah. And gold and silver have built the right technical patterns in my mind.
And gold and silver miners have gone crazy in Australia because of their high
Hmm.
costs that they get to sell their gold at. But uranium, I think the 5 minute pitch for people that haven't followed the story is it's a bit like cryptocurrency. It was down, 90% after Fukushima. Everyone was thinking this is never
Oh
going
yeah.
to be used. And yet I think the US still get, is it 20 or 30%? Some crazy amount of their power for homes comes from nuclear reactors. And there's plenty coming on the pipeline in Japan. There's going to be huge demand for uranium ore. And yet it's in the very bottom at these all-time lows and everyone doesn't want to touch it.
Yeah, I guess I was focusing on precious metals, but you're right, Alex. I have talked a lot about uranium, and the thing I always tell people about is that it's very rare that you get these major super cycles in commodities. The broader picture is that commodities in general, most commodity indexes, have never been this cheap since 1970. Now, a lot of that comes from the fact of industrialization and being able to extract, minerals and resources at a probably cheaper rate or just more scalable in this case. So if you have a larger supply and you don't have as much demand, then prices can come down. But at the moment, you not only have this potential rally in commodities for gold and silver, but uranium has the perfect setup. It's some of the largest miners of uranium are cutting the production. Kazatomprom cut I think it was 17% of all production, and that's massive, almost a 1/5 of their entire production.
Yeah.
And we also had Cameco, second or third largest company, cutting their largest factory off, and I think it's in Canada. So you have all these huge cuts to production. And I think, as well as you mentioned, Japan and a lot of other countries building out reactors. And as I think the topic as well of building out cleaner energy comes up over the next few years. I wish I had more people. This is something I talked about on Twitter. I'm a very big advocate for nuclear energy in the short term because I think it's a great placeholder and it's a little bit more economically efficient to build these reactors, these nuclear reactors that are zero emission and actually cause the least amount of deaths per energy unit created. That's right, even compared to solar and wind. In that case, I think it's a great short term for producing this kind of electricity and helping countries get to their carbon emission levels that they want to reach, if that's the objective, or just for simply energy independence. If you can mine enough uranium in your own country and power your homes, I mean, think about how much negotiation strategy that would bring against OPEC and so many of these, kind of natural gas and oil producing countries in that case. I think it would be great for the US. I think it'd be great for Australia and any country in the world. And I know Australia actually has a large amount of uranium reserves from the time I was doing research on it.
It's another thing that makes me scratch my head. We've got abundance of sunshine, we've got wind, we all live on the coast, we've got uranium, we've got a big desert to dump it all in, but we just have the most expensive power in the world. But I think that shows you the capability of the Australian government, unfortunately.
Not much better here in the US.
One thing that did interest me when I read, I think that one of the books behind me is The Colder War by Marin Katusa, and he speaks about how Russia have 90% of the actual uranium processing. So if everyone's going to be mining uranium, they are the only country in the world basically that can turn it into yellow cake. So then it becomes that geopolitical move between Russia, China, and the US, and that struggle for power in the Middle East. And do you have any thoughts on all that, or you want to avoid going into that too much?
Well, I'll be fair. I definitely have to learn a little bit more about the supply chain system, and I definitely am going to check out the book as well. But yeah, I would say more than anything, if it's enough leverage there, that might be an issue because I know Russia as a country, people you have to understand if you want to know what a country's interests are, understand where their economy is. And as you mentioned, Russia not only has a lot of natural resources, but their entire economy is practically an export economy. It's natural gas and oil in this case, but predominantly natural gas. And it plays a huge role in how they act geopolitically, how Putin as a leader leads forward and expands the economy. And I would say more than anything that we need to, if we want to actually move forward in having uranium, I would say that we probably need to be able to process it in the United States.
I think you've just raised a fantastic point that you didn't even realize about Australia. Look at what our government is promoting: resources and construction, and all the incentives and negative gearing to drive up house prices have just led us to this crazy position we're in right now. And no one wants to touch housing, even though it's completely unaffordable in so many parts of Australia. And that's, as you said, because that's their interests. All these politicians own heaps of houses. They've got them negatively geared. And unfortunately, I don't think much is going to change because of their interests.
Yeah, I mean, there's really the two things that have been propping up housing is the obviously monetary policy. If you're not buying assets, you're losing out. You're losing to inflation eventually. Not to mention The big problem is, as you probably know, in Australia more than anything, the outflow of money from China has just been propping up investment properties, and that's gone from some of the major cities, probably in Sydney, and I know some of the major cities like New York City, Boston, and Los Angeles, even to where I was in Silicon Valley. You would go down entire roads of one of the most beautiful areas of California, and there was no one there. I'd just be, walking or riding my bike around there, and there's no one in the area. And I think it's caused the perfect storm for this continuous bubble to go on. And even in Australia, where it hasn't stopped since 2008, it's continued. So I'm interested to see. I hope things aren't too bad, but more than anything, I think with a reduction in housing prices, it will be good for a lot of Australians, which I hope more than anything.
At one stage, it got over 40% of just investors in the big capital cities, and I'd love to see it come down and let first home buyers afford it. But there was actually a report that went around about corruption and money laundering in the housing markets globally, and Australia rated 10 out of 10 on every index.
Wow.
I think Canada was 8 and maybe the US 6 or something like that. But as you say, a lot of that money was just coming through China, maybe just laundering.
There was in Canada, I remember a story, and it had to do. We've been dealing with this in the United States and Canada as well, with like the heroin epidemic and the war on opioids and everything. There was a lot of fentanyl and drugs moving across from China to Canada, and it was actually being smuggled through the housing market. They were finding ways to basically launder and buy properties in Canada with Chinese money. But yeah, I think it's a huge laundering game, and it's just because people in China, they don't want to have their money in China, and I get it, that, but at the same time, why we allow that in our economy when it's not benefiting everyday citizens, that kind of bugs me in that case, I would say.
Have you seen the opioid epidemic affect communities sort of firsthand over there? Because it's something I read about, and as a pharmacist, I think it's so interesting, the fact that the way that OxyContin was pushed when morphine was going off patent and all that sort of thing, and now we go to fentanyl, and it's just getting this nasty circle of addiction, and then they've been trying to ban kratom, so it's always something in the news in the US.
Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned kratom. One of my friends really likes kratom. He uses it personally. But there's when it comes to the opioid crisis, I don't want to I can't say from firsthand that I've just walked into a city and just seen like the terrible scenarios that happen. But yeah, there are some areas in the United States where it's just streets of people who aren't able to get out of this addiction, this addictive habit. And, I think it has to do with how we treat the drug crisis in America. I think it's a very libertarian point to want to end the war on drugs and things of that sort. And I do fit into that camp because I focus on this just like I would with any issue, as I understand why are people in the position they're in? Why are they using these terrible drugs that can be life-threatening? And I think it has to do with a lot of socioeconomic factors in the United States and 100%. The situation it's built. Yeah. But I would say the big area where I live in the U.S. That I live near is West Virginia. That's been a big problem there. It used to be coal mining country, but build the connection here. They used to have stable jobs, could pay for their families. Everything was good. And coal mining jobs went away. And then after you've lost the one thing that kind of drives your economy and you have nothing else to replace it, and you don't have something of purpose, I guess, in that sense, to put it lightly, then the problem grows.
That's exactly it. I think you've hit on the head. And there was a great study called Rat Park. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Rat Park, yep.
You've heard of it. And when those people had a choice to, play with other rats, they had food, they had a healthy lifestyle and a purpose, they didn't use the drugs. And it's we're just all wired the same, I think, Nick.
Exactly. I can tell you from personal experience, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very thankful. I've had a really nice family growing up. I've always had friends, good mentors, not the richest lifestyle or anything, but I've grown up generally middle class. And I know that those things heavily contributed to me being, the person I am today. But I see similar patterns on the opposite side where people don't have those things. They don't have good family structure, and they don't have good leadership and guidance and a sense of purpose. And those are the exact things that lead to addiction, because when you're struggling with addiction, you're filling a void, and that void is there because you're living in a cage of some sort. So I think in the United States, when we put someone who's already in a bad scenario into a prison with a bunch of bad people and bad influences, you're literally locking them into a physical cage, right?
Yeah.
It's not a good mix, I guess, in that sense.
And I guess just finishing off, I'd say that I met a lot of people in the opioid replacement program at the pharmacy who are some of the nicest people you've met, and the stigma around what addicts are from movies and that it's a lot different to these people that often don't want to be on these substances at all, but they've controlled their life. Moving on though, future ambitions, mate. Donald Trump can be president. Does Nicholas Merten want to be president and sort everything out, or what are your future ambitions?
One day, that's interesting. That's been a childhood dream of mine. One day to potentially be president, but right now my focus is on a thing I call Project Genesis. Right now, it's kind of it's a pseudo name for it. Right now, we haven't really revealed what it is yet, so it's kind of under the table, and we're working on it right now. So I'm excited. More than anything, it's a compilation of trying to achieve 2 or 3 things that I think the crypto space has yet to build that I think would really add to adoption. It's not an ICO. I don't want to do an ICO by any means, but basically it's my vision of what I believe could be a positive for the crypto space. And as you mentioned earlier, it's another one of those varieties of approaches that are going to be in the crypto space over the coming years, and people have to see whether they like it or not, but really focused on driving real adoption of cryptocurrencies. That's a big component of it, and giving people a way to actually be their own bank.
Fantastic to hear. That's always been our mission in Australia, to increase awareness and adoption and education, really. So I think we've spoken about just about everything I wanted to talk about. But finally, do you see the bigger macro cycles of, like demographics? We've seen Japan have this aging population and really struggle. Where do you think the whole world is at in terms of these markets versus money printing? We've gone through that period of great growth, but are the demographics changing, and is this money experiment going to end badly, or where do you think this is all heading?
Well, I think that cryptocurrencies, even though it may seem they came a little early in 2008, I think that the launch of Bitcoin is very significant. It came at a time where there was great financial stress, and even though it wasn't adopted right away, and though it wasn't perfect, and still to this day, I think it needs work, I think that cryptocurrencies are coming at the absolutely right time. It's not something that's going to happen in a year or two. We're not going to have global adoption. The internet right now is a perfect example. The internet only has around 50% adoption across the world. And that's growing at around like 1%, I think, every year. There's some global statistics online. So as you mentioned, this monetary experiment that's going on, as this continues to topple the dominoes, more and more countries, and continues to fail more countries, whether or not they simply just can't keep up with the dollar, or people have just simply lost trust in their government and their currency. I think it's going to be a slow domino process, a lot going on in South America. And then eventually, I think in 2019 or 2020, you're going to see a really big challenge and a devaluation of some sort to either the Indian rupee, the Russian ruble, in the Chinese yuan, one of the major currencies of the world, maybe even the Japanese yen. And when that comes, when you start to have an either large emerging market or a developed economy get a test on their currency, this is really going to shake things up. This is going to help us get to 6 or 7% adoption, which is going to be our .com bubble for crypto. We haven't even reached it yet. We're at less than 1% of adoption. And when we reach that point, what is it going to look like? I think that's the fascinating point. I think there's a lot of investment opportunity, but more than anything, I'm just excited to commonly know that there are going to be people transacting in crypto. That's going to be really exciting stuff. And I think it's going to be over the next decade to 2 decades, we're going to get crypto adoption to around 50% of the people in the world. And that'll be really exciting.
Particularly in developing nations, I think the opportunity to skip the whole banking system is phenomenal. And for people that are having a tough time in the bear market or got in at the wrong time, any advice for those people?
I would say, as I mentioned earlier, we are at less than 1% adoption. I know it is very difficult to get through the people who keep kind of selling hopium, like next week it's going to be this price, or people kind of sell it as it should come quick. But I can tell you right now, look at the variety of options we have. We have an equities market that's extremely overvalued, and if central banks don't continue their monetary experiment, even if they do, I don't know if there's a good chance that it's going to keep going from the highs that they're at. Yeah. You've got commodities here, which I think will be a good short-term hedge. But again, it can't be really used as a commercial money in this case, like a currency can. I think what we have here is the next evolution in money. And to miss out on that next step, I think you'll not only miss out on a lot of investment opportunity, but also you'll miss out on a really cool piece of technology. Yeah. And even though it'll take some time, I think it's probably the best place to have a good chunk of money at the moment. I can say that at least personally. I've got my investments in crypto, and
Yeah.
I can't wait to see this space grow over the years.
Yeah, and I'd just say to people, don't beat yourself up. I know that someone that's been through a lot of these cycles since 2012, I didn't think it was going to go this low for this long. And I think we were both
Yeah.
in the camp hoping that 6,000 would hold. And I thought as we grow, there's so many people in it now, it's going to become less volatile, but it hasn't. It's still having these huge corrections. So don't let that volatility throw you off. There's plenty of crypto funds around the world that are down 80% as well. It's not just you that's made the mistakes.
Yeah, I think everyone was blown away by the break on 6,000. And the reason why I was is because I remember it was February in Australia when I was there in Sydney, and I was in my Airbnb and I was looking at it and I'm like, there's no way it can break below this price. Like we've had the 70% correction. And I thought this time it's different. And
Yeah.
from the few times I've thought this time it's different, it usually isn't. So I think we've gone through the vast majority of the correction here. We've had I think a 90% plus correction, if not 85%, and we're now finally going through the bottoming process, which is I think even more difficult than the downtrend because you're just sitting sideways, and it's a matter of patience. And at this point, guys, as Alex was saying, don't beat yourself up. Not to mention, this is a time to accumulate. The people who want to buy in the middle of the euphoria, they're missing out. They're coming late to the party. Yeah. It's like coming to the party like when the punch bowl is drying up, right? Yeah. And you want to get there early, have a good time.
Mate, I really appreciate that. That's a deep dive into a lot of topics. I'll put all your links for people to follow you in the description below, and we'll have to do this again sometime.
Alex, definitely. I'd love to come on anytime, man. Thanks for giving me a platform to talk, and it was nice catching up with you.
And thanks for tuning in, guys. Cheers.